Hi, this is Jim Gibson with Business Sense Podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. Today we're going to be talking about something that actually may sound mundane at the beginning, but I'm going to give you some tricks and some ideas that will help you in dealing with your customers, or, hey, if you're an employee, dealing with your boss. And of course, if you're thinking of going in business, well, you know something? I hear people say, well, I'm going to go in business so I don't have a boss. Well, when you go in business, you have customers, and customers become your boss, and they can fire you kind of quickly if you don't perform. So I'm going to talk today about interpersonal relationships and also communications. I'm going to start out with something that happened to me that I learned a big lesson on many, many years ago about dealing with customers. I got a call one afternoon from my boss, and she said, hey, I'm going to transfer you this call. It's from an employee up in Canada, and this is when I was with Burlington Air Express. And I was not responsible for Canada. I was responsible for the U.S., and our IT department was responsible only for the U.S., and the Canadians had their own IT department. Now, if you're a Canadian, this is not against you. This is what happened. And so I said, sure, I'll take the call. And I took the call, and it was this, nice person from Canada, and he was telling me he needs information on fax machines. And I thought that was kind of curious, but I said, okay, why don't I do some research for you? I want to make sure I recommend something that is compatible with the Canadian system, and also that would work for your needs. And I took down, some of his needs, how many fax machines he would need, how often they would be faxing, things like that, so I get the right model number and the right manufacturer and all those other things. Didn't think much of it. I got 10 or 20 other things on my plate, so I said, well, I thought to myself, I'll get back to it by the end of the week. So, I didn't do anything. I just thanked him for his time. I said, I'll call you back. Didn't say anything else. And I say about 2 hours later, the senior VP of Burlington Air Express came to my cube and said, how come you're not getting that information for the Canadians about the fax machine? And I said, well, sir, he just called me like 2 hours ago, and I haven't had a chance. I will take care of it, I promise. And he said, well, get to it, okay? Because the guy in Canada called his senior VP and complained about us. And I don't want to hear any more complaints, because they called me, and now I'm telling you, get this done. Well, before he even finished, my boss shows up and says, hey, what's going on? How come I'm getting calls from the senior VP that you're not responsive to the Canadian employee? That's unacceptable. You need to get on the job here. You need to do this, and you need to do that. And I thought, and I told her, I said, it's about a fax machine. I said, as soon as I get done the research, I will call the person up in Canada, and I'll let them know about the fax machine. Well, she was ticked, and so was the senior VP at me, and I thought, wow, I'm trying to help the guy, and he gets me in trouble with my boss and my boss's boss's boss. I don't want to see these people hanging around my cube yelling at me over a stupid fax machine 2 hours after the guy just asked for information. I told him I'd get back to him. He didn't even have the courtesy to call me and complain. He just went right to the top, which really annoyed everyone in the IT department that I was not responding about a fax machine. Oh, gosh, it sounded so trivial at the time. But it wasn't to this guy in Canada, I guess. So I thought I'd make his life miserable. After all, he made my life miserable, so I'm going to get him back, And so what I decided to do is I was going to call him every 10 to 15 minutes and tell him I was working on that fax machine information that he wanted. And I thought after a while he'd get completely annoyed. I'd fill up his email, and it would all be, I'm working on your fax machine, I'm working on your fax machine, I'm working on your fax machine. Just drive him absolutely nuts. And so eventually, after a day or two of doing that, I got tired of doing that. And so I decided to look up what fax machine he needed. And it wasn't that hard. It took me about an hour just to confirm that fax machine would work in Canada. And so I called him up, and I told him what he needed, and he thanked me, and that was it. And I went back to work. Didn't think much of it. A little annoyed, ticked, that my boss's boss and his boss were yelling at me over something so trivial as a fax machine. So to make a long story short, about 10 minutes later, I get a visit by my boss, who says, "Wow, you did a great job. He really liked all the follow-up you gave him and all the details and everything else. You kept him in the loop. He felt great about it." And I'm thinking, this is a fax machine. It's not that big of a deal. But to my boss, it was a big deal. And then all of a sudden, the senior VP again of Burlington came down, this time with a smile on his face, and he said, "Hey, you did a really good job on this fax machine." And I'm completely baffled because I was trying to annoy the guy, and he actually liked it. But, my attempts to try to annoy him caused my senior VP to come down and say how great it was that I was communicating all the details to this guy in Canada. Gosh, sometimes life is crazy. But I learned a lesson that day, and the lesson I learned is over-communicate. And it has been an invaluable lesson to me from there on out. Sometimes your boss, if you're an employee, and I'm going to talk to employees and people who are thinking of business and people who are in business. Over-communicate, because sometimes your boss or customer is wondering, what in the world are you doing? I have no idea. I haven't heard from that person in days. I have no idea if this project's on track or not on track. Now, when I started my business, one of the things that developed very quickly is I was able to work with a lot of big corporations that had a lot of, what would you call them, little offices all throughout the United States, and sometimes big offices, but they had a lot of locations throughout the U.S. And so I gave them a pricing on a contract that the work would be standard throughout the United States, and that if they signed the contract, I would just give them quotes based on that contract. And so I was at the point where I was getting anywhere from 2 to 5 installations a week of voice and data networks all throughout the United States. Not just cabling, by the way. It was actual cabling plus networks. And so it was getting kind of hard to keep track of all these contractors, all these vendors throughout the United States. So what I did was I came up with a program. I wrote a program. And I wanted to write the program so someone coming right out of high school, I could teach them the program of how to manage vendors, and that they could use this program to, manage the vendors. And it was kind of a simple program. It was nothing major. So when we would get an order to put a system in, let's say in Milwaukee or whatever city, Philadelphia, Boston, whatever city it was all cut and dry at that point. So what we would do is we'd put that information into the system and we would launch it. And once we launched it, the system would come back each day with to-do lists for that location. And so, it would say 6 weeks before the installation, you had to order, it's a deadline, you had to order your internet access, you had to order your phone lines. Maybe 2 months before the installation, you had to sign a contract with the vendor to get the work done and things like that. Well, everything we did in that database, in that software program that I wrote, would email to the customer what exactly we did. It would say, today we ordered the internet lines for your Milwaukee location, and we ordered the phone lines for your Baltimore location, and we signed an agreement to have the system installed on such and such date from this vendor or that vendor. So I could take someone from high school that knew nothing about IT, and I could show them the program that I wrote, and I would tell them, just follow the program. So when you you log in the morning, it would say you had to do 10 things. You had to call this vendor, and you had to call that vendor, and you had to order this, and you had to order that. You had to make sure the parts were being shipped on a certain date. Maybe 3 weeks before the installation. You never send things ahead of time, too far ahead of time. They get lost in the warehouse of the vendor. So I had certain time frames that they had to have these things done by. And so it turned a pretty complex thing into something that was very simple for someone who's not experienced in IT to run for me. And it worked really well. But the best thing about it was it over-communicated to the customer. And the customer being, the big corporation that asked us to install a system a week, and the other companies that asked us to install 2 or 3 systems a week, and so that 2 to 5 systems on average, maybe sometimes even more installations per week, were all followed up on. The other thing is, too, when we over-communicated not only to the customer, but we also over-communicated to the vendor. So a week before the installation, we would call up and say, do you have it on your calendar to start cabling next week? And they would say yes. 2 days before they were supposed to go out to do the cabling or to do the installation, my employee would receive a to-do list to call that person to confirm that it was on the calendar and that they were still going to be there at that time. And then the day before the installation, they got a request that my employee, or the software did the request, that my employee call that person in charge of installation at that vendor location and remind them that an installation was going to take place tomorrow, and want to make sure that they were aware of that, and wanted to make sure that they had people assigned and that everything was on track, to start at 8 o'clock the next morning or whatever it was. So I learned through that little situation about the Canadian dude that wanted a fax machine, and he was so hyper about it, drove me nuts. But I learned to over-communicate with the customer, and I taught that to my people. So when one of my dispatchers got upset that she was being yelled at on a daily basis by a director of IT to a big corporation, because she always wanted to know what was happening, what was happening. And I said, well, be realistic about this. That director of IT at that company doesn't know what you're doing. She has no idea. So I want you to call her every day at 10 o'clock. And I want you to call her every day at 4 o'clock. And I want you to give her updates. Even if there's nothing happens, I want you to say nothing is happening, but I'm working on it. We have this problem here, or we have that problem there. We're working on it. Your system went down last night. We're working on why. Just over communicate. Well, I got a phone call from that IT director at the big corporation, and she thanked me. She said, "Oh, I love working with your employees. They always keep me informed, and it's great." And so that just reinforced to me that you have to, what I call over-communicate, even though I don't think it's over-communicate. It's just communicating. In a lot of ways, this over-communicating, or what I call it, again, over-communicating, is just this over-communicating is just a interpersonal technique. It's dealing with people. It's just learning how to deal with people. And a lot of people in IT think that it's all about technology, running an IT business or being in IT, but not having interpersonal skills is just as important as having IT skills. There was a study once done about engineers. I don't remember what type of engineers, electrical, mechanical, I have no idea. I can't remember that. But it was significant, and it was based on who gets promoted and who got promoted first and things like that. And they came back with the concept that the people who were getting promoted were not necessarily the best engineers, but they were the best in dealing with people. They were people-oriented. And they got promoted over other engineers that were far superior. So if you're a technician, think this thing through. You can be the world's greatest technician, but if you don't have interpersonal type of skills, if you don't know how to deal with people, then, there's a good chance you're just not going to rise up to the level you need to, or you're not going to keep as many customers that are, that is necessary. So think it through, come up with plans to over-communicate and document what you've done. And one last thing you need to think about on all this in this area, and I used to tell people when a job is done or you did something beyond the ordinary, well, I guess it's even ordinary, in your over-communication, make sure that you close the loop. If someone has given you a responsibility to do something, then it's your responsibility to get back to them. So if they call you up and you answer the phone and they say, hey, Tom, I need, reprogramming of a certain system in Cincinnati, and you're writing up the work order. and let's say you assign it, Tom, to someone else, you assign it to Betty to do the work, you don't have a right to walk away from it. You have to close the loop. So you have to go back to the customer and say, hey, that work order you asked me to open up yesterday, I signed it to Betty, and we're working on it. Now, Betty has to report back to you and the customer. So if she's, assigning a vendor to it, she has to report back to you the vendor has been assigned. And I consider that what's called closing the loop. And then when she's done, she needs to call you as, you, Tom, as the person is given the responsibility to Betty. And then Betty at the same time and you at the same time need to call the customer to make sure that the customer has gotten that information. The bottom line is you got to close the loop. Whoever's given you assignment to do, you have to take it from there. You cannot just assign it to someone else and walk away from it. That's unacceptable. You own that problem now. So if you delegate it to someone else to fix that problem, that's fine. You're still responsible, though, to close the loop and inform the customer what's going on. And also the person you assign it to is responsible to you to close the loop to you. So you always have to think about over-communicating. Interpersonal relationships is very necessary. Closing the loop. And the last thing that I want to talk about is, does a tree make noise when it falls in the forest? I know that sounds out of place, but I'm going to attach it here. Do you know if a tree makes noise if it falls in the wilderness? Can you prove it? You can't. You can't prove that a tree makes noise when it falls in the wilderness. So, what I would say to my people was, when you've accomplished something of significance, make sure you take credit for it. Make sure you go to your boss and say, or to the customer and say, we had this problem, I solved the problem, and this is how I solved it. Because if you don't speak up, no one knows you did the job. No one knows there was a problem that was solved. So maybe in your daily communications with your customer, if you have that type of customer that gives you work on a regular basis, that you say, hey, we had a problem here, but I solved the problem. And that's sort of like a tree falling in the wilderness. You don't know if you can't hear it, that the tree actually fell. So some ideas today that I think will help you in dealing with your boss if you're an employee, your customer if you own a business. And these are things that you should be just doing in life. Keeping people informed, closing the loop, and recognizing that no one knows a tree fell in the wilderness unless you tell them. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and thank you again for listening to my podcast. This is Jim Gibson with Business Sense.